do novels start? I have to confess I'm fascinated by the whole process. From the germination of an idea to the end result, a published book, often seems to depend on a quite random sequence of events. Chance plays as much of a part in determining the final outcome as deliberate choice, or perhaps it's a mixture of the two. I'm always interested to hear about the way other writers approach the task of rendering historical fact into fiction, or indeed into memoir or biography. Does an idea for a book come to you out of the blue, or is it arrived at after months of painstaking research? In the case of my own 2011 novel, The Dark Tower, it was very much a eureka moment, although the months of research, much of it in the British Library, followed soon after, and were just as important. I had been looking through some old family papers and turned up a diary written by a great-great-aunt, which described her horrified reaction to the news of a terrible defeat by the British Army at the hands of the Zulu army at Isandlwana, in what is now KwaZulu-Natal, on the 22nd of January 1879. This discovery was the starting point for the novel, because I realised that I knew almost nothing about the conflict during which this military catastrophe occurred. I'd heard of the Battle of Rorke's Drift, of course. Anyone who's seen the 1960s film Zulu, starring Michael Caine, will have some idea what that was about. But of course that was a victory for the British. One might almost say a necessary victory, given that it occurred only a day after the disaster at Isandlwana. I decided that the only way to find out more about this largely forgotten event was to go where it happened. Isandlwana is a disturbing place. Even if one knows nothing of the grim events enacted there, it still leaves a powerful impression, with its barren outcrops of low hills surrounded by a grassy plain, seamed with dry riverbeds, and with the squat tower-like shape of the mountain from which it takes its name looming overhead. It is the landscape evoked with eerie prescience by Robert Browning in his 1855 poem Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came, which supplied me with the title for the book and its epigraph. Burningly it came on me all at once. This was the place. Those two hills on the right, crouched like two bulls locked horn in flight, while to the left a tall sculped mountain. Here at around midday on January the 22nd, 1879, over 2,000 men lost their lives in one of the bloodiest battles fought on foreign soil the British Army had ever faced. What made the defeat even more of a blow to the esteem of the British Imperial forces was that it was inflicted by an enemy most would have regarded as savages, an enemy which, though numerically superior, was woefully underpowered in terms of weaponry. In fact, as anyone interested in the history of the Anglo-Zulu Wars will know, the Zulus were far from being the undisciplined rabble of populist supposition, but were a formidable fighting force. Nor, despite the myths that have since grown up about the conflict, were the British soldiers as inexperienced or their leaders as incompetent as has been suggested. Bad luck certainly played a part in the tragedy, as did poor judgment by at least one of the commanding officers, but in the main the British Army fought heroically against overwhelming odds and died, as so many have in conflicts before and since, defending a little piece of ground not worth the fighting for. After such a crushing disaster, morale both of troops in the line of battle and of those back home had to be restored without delay. On the day after the Battle of Isandlwana came the famous victory of Rorke's Drift. It is perhaps hardly surprising that this incident, in which 139 British soldiers successfully defended the mission station at Rorke's Drift from an attack by 4,000 Zulus, is far more widely remembered by the British at least than what happened on the previous day. The fact that 11 Victoria Crosses, the most ever awarded for a single military action, were awarded to the defenders of Rorke's Drift, whilst only 3 out of a far greater number of the no less heroic combatants at Isandlwana received the same honour, is surely no accident. Now, if one visits the place, it is hard not to be moved by the thought of what happened here, reminders of which are everywhere to be seen, in the cairns of white stones which mark the mass graves of soldiers who, like Drummer Hodge in Thomas Hardy's poem of that name about another South African conflict, the Boer War, which was to leave deep scars on the British psyche, have become part of that foreign land they once set out to conquer. They throw in Drummer Hodge to rest, uncoffined, just as found. His landmark is a copier crest that breaks the veldt around. In the little museum at Isandlwana are memorabilia, cap badges, belt buckles, letters, drawings, diaries, retrieved from the field of battle and preserved, as a poignant reminder that wars are fought by human beings, not machines. If the recent upsurge of interest in the lives of ordinary soldiers on the 100th anniversary of the start of the First World War has demonstrated anything, it is that we are no longer prepared to consign those who fought and died in such conflicts to the anonymity which was the fate of the common soldier for centuries. In writing The Dark Tower, I wanted to show the devastating effects of war on individual lives, and to make the point that even though the nature of modern warfare has changed and its technology has become vastly more powerful, the physical and psychological damage suffered by those caught up in such conflicts remains largely unchanged. In depicting what arguably might be described as the first modern war, I have chosen to focus not only on the combatants but also on those left behind, that is, the women. For if my novel had a starting point or a single moment of inspiration, it was not my visit to Saint-Ouen, nor David Rattray's wonderful talks on the subject at the Royal Geographical Society, but an entry in a slim cloth-bound diary. February 13th, 1879. I must not wait a moment longer because I want to write down the dreadful news we have had from the Cape, where our troops are fighting against the Zulus. Great Aunt Laura then goes on to copy out the account of the battle sent by the commander of the British forces in Natal, Lord Chelmsford, to the Secretary for War, and published in the previous day's Times. I regret to state a very disastrous engagement took place on the 22nd of January between the Zulus and a portion of No. 3 column left to guard the camp about 10 miles in front of Rorke's Drift. The Zulus came down in overwhelming numbers, and in spite of the gallant resistance made by 5 companies of the 1st Battalion of the 24th Regiment, they overwhelmed them. This terrible news, writes the then 24-year-old Laura Barrett, has caused a most profound sensation all over the country, and 8 regiments are ordered out in 10 days. A later journal entry strikes a more anguished note. I have been through the cloud and have known what real trouble is, and in the dark and cloudy day I could not write. A section of the diary has been torn out at this point. It was this, and the confessional tone of the above, which led me to speculate about whether Laura herself might have had a more personal connection with the terrible news she has related, and if so, what that connection might have been. The few facts I know about her, a woman who, though living into her 90s, never married, but was said to have once been engaged to a man, perhaps a soldier, who had died in Africa, provided further food for thought. I realised that Laura's story was also one I wanted to tell. Out of that realisation came the opening pages of The Dark Tower.